Joining us now from Miami is Senior Editor-at-Large at Newsweek, Josh Hammer. Josh, so good to talk to you. We have heard from Donald Trump, and he took aim at the Democrats, saying he's not prepared a speech for tonight. Take a listen.
I'm not a Democrat. I'm able to make a speech on pretty quick notice. If I win, I know what I'm going to say, and I don't even want to think about the losing part. I would like to tell all of the people that are online to stay online. We have tremendous Republican lines, and I've been asked actually to say it. It takes a while. I'd like to just make the statement that I'd like the Republicans to stay online. Democrats, if they'd like, they can leave. But I'd like the Republicans to stay online.
This is just classic Donald Trump, isn't it? Still making fun at the Democrats right up until the very last moment. What's your assessment of how he's really performed in the final days as we've seen the polls tighten?
So, look, Gabrielle, I predicted months ago that Donald Trump was going to win this election. I'm not backing away from that prediction right now in the very final minutes, quite literally, of this particular race. I will caveat that by saying that there is not really a possible outcome out there that would shock me. Having said that, I think it is more likely than not that Donald Trump wins, especially looking at the early voting data that we've seen out of a lot of states like Nevada, where Republicans outright led the early vote for the first time ever in early voting out in that state. Republicans in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, probably this election's #1 battleground. Republicans are far, far outperforming right there relative to where they were 4 years ago, let alone 8 years ago. So the data that I'm seeing overall is looking quite good. Now, having said that, we're going to have to see what happens here, and it obviously could go either way, but you way rather be in Donald Trump's shoes than in Kamala Harris's shoes. And, lest we miss the forest for the trees, Gabrielle, I think that there is a very important point here to make, and it is a slightly higher level, 35,000-foot altitude level point. There was a monumental polling miss in 2020 and a monumental polling miss in 2016. At this very stage, as the American people were about to decide their president 4 years ago in 2020, Joe Biden was ahead in the polls by 8 to 8.5 points. Right now, it is within 1 point, give or take, depending on your pollster of choice. Right now, Donald Trump is leading in most of the swing state polling that I've seen. So if there is anything remotely close to a polling miss like we saw 4 years ago or 8 years ago, Donald Trump is likely going to win comfortably. The Democrats are basically banking on there being a 2022 midterm election style polling miss as opposed to a presidential style polling miss. I think they're wrong to expect that. I understand why they're doing it. They have a self-interest in thinking along those lines, but I think that is ultimately incorrect prognostication for the very simple reason that Donald Trump is a unique political figure, and he has these unique low propensity voters who turn out for him in a way that they will not turn out for any generic Republican. So I think the polls are basically looking at a 2016-2020 style miss. I think Donald Trump's going to be back in the White House come January 2025.
Josh, a CNN exit poll has just dropped, and it found that 75% of Americans are not happy with the way the country is being run. 75%. That's surely pretty damaging to the Democrats and their campaign.
Yeah, so this dropped very shortly before you and I came on air. I actually had it on live right here in my home office. I was watching CNN live at that time. And, Chris Wallace, formerly the Fox News anchor, now he's on CNN, gets on there and he says in real time, looking at this data, he's pouring over the numbers, looking down at his paper, and he says, looking at this, I think Kamala Harris will basically need a miracle to win. I'm paraphrasing closely, but that basically is what Chris Wallace just said. And immediately the other CNN anchors are like, oh my God, no, let's not go there yet. But they're basically already playing the blame game, and the very first votes have actually not already been cast yet. We've literally just seen the exit polling data. But Chris Wallace is basically right there, where you have 70 to 75% of Americans who say that they are dissatisfied or outright angry. They are livid at the current direction of the country. And by the way, who can blame them? I very much share in that particular antipathy bordering on outright anger. But when you have that kind of number, it actually would be a miracle if Democrats can win. Right now, Americans have a 28% approval rating. It depends on the poll, but 28% of Americans say that the country is on the right track. So maybe 35% of Americans, a little closer to that, say that they actually approve of Joe Biden's time in office right now. The numbers, no matter how you slice or dice it, are very, very low. The incumbent party just does not win American elections given that kind of data. Now, is Donald Trump a uniquely hated phenomenon such that that Democrats can still prevail in light of those historical headwinds? The media would like to have you think so, based on the fact that he has already won one presidential election and came shockingly close to winning another 4 years ago. I think that he probably is not. Again, I think he's likely headed towards a victory tonight.
Look, you're on the ground in Miami, Josh. What's it like? What's the feeling between voters compared to, say, 2020 and 2016? And also, we touched on the media's coverage, but how does it compare to previous years when the media has covered Donald Trump? And now he's really taken a different approach of going on long podcasts. I feel like more Americans have been able to get a better sense of who he is.
So I think that the alternative media paths have really helped him when it comes to things like the Joe Rogan long form podcast that both he and JD Vance have done. JD Vance's interview with Joe Rogan in particular got rave reviews. People were really just loving that particular conversation because JD is such a natural in this particular kind of setting. And they have done that. They have gone above and beyond to try to get around the confines of the mainstream media, but they've done a little bit of that as well. I mean, they have also been willing to sit down for all sorts of mainstream media coverage. So they're really kind of doing an all of the above strategy, Gabrielle. And at this point, 8 years after Donald Trump first was elected president, 9 years after he had that famous gilded escalator descent at Trump Tower in 2015, I think the American people understand that what they're hearing about him from the corporate media gatekeepers, from the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, I think they understand that they're not actually getting the full picture, and that the Donald Trump that they had in office is the one that they want back. Because no matter what they say about Donald Trump, they can say that he is a fascist, a Hitlerite, whatever. The point is, the man was president of the United States. He has a track record. He is not an empty slate. He is not an empty vessel, a blank vessel. He is not kind of an empty book where you can kind of fill in whatever you want. We saw what happened. We saw historically low unemployment, a historically soaring stock market, 401ks, Roth IRAs, all your stock returns were really returning bang for your buck. We had a relatively secure border. We had sanity and stability on the world stage. I could go on. The point was that he was actually president for 4 years, and it was not that long ago. He was only out of power 4 years ago. So the American people have a very clear choice right now. You can choose to go with the failed policies of the past 4 years in the Biden-Harris Democratic Party track record, or you can go back to the status quo ante of what Donald Trump was 4 years prior to that. The head-to-head matchup that I've seen, right track, wrong track, all of the are you angry, are you happy, are you dissatisfied, all of the data that I've seen right now shows that Donald Trump is likely headed towards a victory.
Now we are at this point in time, we will wait and see what the result is. But as you are predicting, if it is a Donald Trump victory, what does that actually look like? What happens to Kamala Harris? What happens to the Democrats? Are we going to see protests erupt?
I think so. I have no reason for thinking that there will not be, and that brings me no particular joy to say. But we have raised essentially an entire entitled generation or two in the form of Gen Z or my fellow millennials here in the United States, those who are accustomed to winning, who are accustomed to Democrats winning, people who kind of came of age politically speaking during the Barack Obama years, and they are basically a bunch of pampered crybabies, and they are not emotionally, mentally, or intellectually equipped for someone like Donald Trump and the Republican Party to come into power. We saw a lot of this in 2016. We saw a lot of the universities offer cry-in sessions, all sorts of counseling services. You basically could take the day off of school, or God forbid, if you're such an emotionally insecure 20-something in an office, you could skip the day of work to go home, sleep in, and I guess get drunk at 11 a.m. because just to try to drink your sorrows away. All that sort of stuff, I think, is actually going to happen. And I do fear it might not be tomorrow, it might not be the day after that, but I do fear that sooner rather than later, if Donald Trump wins, then you probably are looking at some sort of George Floyd style riots taking this country really just down the gutter with it. Very similar to what we saw to a lesser extent in January 2017 after he was elected the first time. That was when you had the so-called Women's March in Washington, D.C., and it was a similar all sorts of smashing and looting and vandalism display. Now, it was really kind of child's play compared to what we saw during the George Floyd riots, but one way or the other, you're going to have a lot of people freaking out, and unfortunately, I've already heard a lot of stories here in the United States of people boarding up their windows because they don't want the looters, the shopkeepers here. It's going to get ugly. I take some solace that I personally live in Florida, where people tend to be a little bit more rational, a little bit more sane. But if I were living in a Chicago or a Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, someplace like that, I would be a little nervous about what these next few days might look like.
Senior Editor at Large at Newsweek, Josh Hammer, really appreciate you making the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much.